I'm really excited now to welcome you all to the Brooklyn Rail's 1076th New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, Program Associate here at the Rail, and today I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC for a conversation featuring Ming Smith, Daisy Desrosiers, and Emmanuel Iduma. And now I'll introduce our guests and host for today. Ming Smith's practice is a tale of 5 decades spent examining transitory occurrence, intervals at which figures blur, atmospheres alter, vistas haunt, souls whir, and opposites engage in allied work. Smith's photographic approach is both scientific and celestial, and experimentation and adventure mark her fascination with detail as it stretches across form and mood. Her dedication to music, dance, and theater underlines the synergistic excellence that characterizes her secondary, if metaphoric, occupations as anthropologist, historian, and poet. Many of Smith's subjects are well-known Black cultural figures such as Alice Coltrane, Grace Jones, Nina Simone, and Tina Turner. Daisy Desrosiers is the director and chief curator of Gund Gallery at Kenyon College since 2021. Recent projects include the exhibitions No Justice Without Love, Christine Sun Kim, Omi Oh My, and Ming Smith, Jazz Requiem, Notations in Blue. She was also one of the inaugural co-curators of the first MoGA Toronto Triennial in 2021, and on the jury of the Canadian Pavilion at the Venice Biennale in 2024. Our host today, Emmanuel Iduma, is the author of 2 works of nonfiction, including the travelogue A Stranger's Pose and I Am Still With You, a memoir. His criticism and nonfiction have appeared in Aperture, N+1, the New York Review of Books, and other publications. He's based between Lagos, Nigeria, and Norwich, UK. Thank you all so much for joining us on the NSE today, and I'm so thrilled to turn it over to you, Emmanuel, to get us started.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. And it's such a pleasure to do this with Ming and with Daisy. I am particularly thrilled because Ming's photographs, like I imagine for many of you here, are some of the most outstanding images about American life, but also in general about travels, place, mood, texture, shadows, light. We can go on and on. And I think in the first place that it's a particular pleasure because her work is at this moment being exhibited across almost 4 venues between now and the end of the year. And I hope that this conversation would serve as some kind of primer, especially for people who haven't seen the work before, but also people who need to return to the work. Hopefully you can catch it across the country, really. So the first question I wanted to ask Ming is in relation to the show that is currently up at Nicola Vassell Gallery, which is titled On the Road, and a very, very good title, actually. And one of the things that this show sets out to do, as stated in the press release, is to really encapsulate the arc of your exploratory impulses. And I wanted you to begin by sort of giving us a sense of what those impulses were between 1972 and 1993, which is sort of the timestamp of those images. And what were those impulses and how did you walk through them?
To make a long story short, I started photographing in New York in the 70s. It was it was in the beginning, or it had started a few years before because of the civil rights movement, the Black arts movement. And I was asked to join a group of photographers, Black photographers, all male, Kamangi. And the main, what caught me and why I wanted to be a part of this group is I learned about photography as an art form. I took a class at Howard, but it was I asked them what you could do with photography. Even though I was photographing, I didn't know I was doing basically street photography. And the teacher said you could photograph machinery or something else very, very medical or something like that. And I had no interest in that. And so when I was in New York, I discovered photography as an art form. And they talked about, your practice, the technical aspects of photography, basically street shooting. But what really grabbed me was that their aim was to capture the lives of Black people, an authentic interpretation of what we saw. It wasn't a stereotype or what has been in the media that represented us. There was like almost, if any, then. Now it's different now, but back then there were few images of Blacks, even with television. It's a completely different world. And the images were always negative. And so I found in myself that I wanted to photograph the love and the humanity of Black people, or, of my life, since I was, living, living as a single person, married, my friends, the culture. I wanted to capture the beauty of that. And one thing else I wanted to say, yes, so when I look at my different bodies of work, it was really a reflection of my life and how I felt about it, which was authentic. And so some of these moments here, I would have forgotten until I saw my contact sheets or photographs, and I remember it, a lot of the different moments. So that was in the beginning.
Thank you, Ming. So I think I would want Daisy to begin, to sort of respond to the multiple curatorial and critical configurations or threads that we can find in Ming's work. So, there are 3 shows or 4 shows actually are going to be open concurrently. And essentially, each of these shows have sort of used a certain kind of framework to think through the work that Ming has done. And I'm particularly interested in how you began to think about looking at Ming's archive, right? When you were putting together the show at the Gond. As we've talked about recently, it's sort of connected to the same notion of being on the road. So why is the road an important framework or an important overarching framework for Ming's work?
Wow, this is the entire hour just addressing this. Well, there's many through line with the exhibition, and we see some of the images of the installation at Nicolas Vassel right now on the screen. But you're right, the through line of On the Road seems to me, and Ming, correct me if I'm wrong, that it's one of the thread in which her work is being made. That Ming is a witness walking around, is a witness kind of unfolding, is a witness paying close attention. And that's what our images are capturing, either as she's walking at night, attending a jazz concert, discovering a city. Mig and I met, and we were trying to kind of recall our first encounter earlier today in the most magical way. And I remember that in one of our first conversation, well, first I didn't know Ming was had grew up in Columbus, Ohio. So I didn't know that she had this relationship to the state of Ohio, where the gun is at Kenyon College. But I remember in one of our first conversations, she mentioned that today people maybe have seen 10 to 15% of her work. And it just made me think, because when we discover, when you are introduced, or when you revisit Ming's practice, there's such a depth and breadth that it makes you feel, you know, the world, she makes you see the world in such a bigger, more ethereal and open way, that I was just really curious about what's the rest of the archive? What is it that we have not seen? And certainly from the vantage point of an academic museum, I'm interested in modeling for the next generation of museum goer, of citizen, what's the origin story of an artist? And someone like Ming Smith that has 5 decades of practice to show for herself. If we look at the early beginning, and Ming reflected with me on being on the road in Europe, and kind of moving between cities, seeing a landscape for the first time. And I started to think with her, as we dig through the archive, about identity formation outside of the US. We know Ming in relationship to Harlem. We know Ming in relationship to the Kamonge workshop. But I was curious to look at what comes before that informs what has been such a core of her practice, or the way we know Ming. And she kindly dived into this journey with me, allowing us to kind of look at films together, to be able to see also how she had witnessed, captured, and reflected on Black lives outside of the US, as she's a young mother, as she's a young photographer, kind of owning her craft. And so the exhibition is very much this recomposition of thinking about Ming, you know, being able to see Cartier-Bresson's work for the first time, or Brassai, who I believe has played an important role in your practice, Ming. This idea of the blur, and when those first manifestation, or this idea of intervening on the film itself are showing up. And so our selection at the Gun, which is titled Jazz Requiem, Notation in Blue, allows us to look at some of the images that will feel really key to Ming's work, or how we understand her practice. And yet many of the images in that in our exhibition are printed for the first time. And so it's just a beautiful opportunity to look at the origin story, and again to look at how Blackness and the poetry that Ming's allows us to kind of unpack and be a part of, how it took form in the early beginnings, or as she's away from home. And so again, to your point, this idea of on the road has become somewhat of a through line, because she's all about movement. You know, it's movement and light with Ming. And so we think about movement in terms of what's in front of the lens, but also her being in movement between different places, and capturing that as she's moving from one space to another, from one city to another, and really a testing of her journey, in our case, through Europe for the most part.
That's such a, I mean, the photograph that we're just looking at is such a powerful one, and it makes me want to ask Ming, just simply, what has travels and journeying meant for you in your practice over the course of this 5 decades, especially when you began to really see the world outside of America. I mean, I should say that one of my favorite photographs, actually, of all time, is the photograph that you took when you went to Senegal. And it's this photo of a man just sort of walking, and the trees are sort of windswept, and such a powerful, for me, evocation of the African continent, not seen in the usual way, but just in a very poetic and tender even way. So I'm curious to know, especially given what Daisy had said about how travels and the road was important as a curatorial framing. What travels, journeying, looking at places, seascape, landscape, what it has meant for you in your practice?
So I've been always interested in the culture around Black lives. It's like documenting the cultural. aspect of it. For example, around jazz, I never set out to shoot jazz musicians. It was like, this was my life. It was presented. I shoot what's around me. So actually, a lot of these photographs, I had planned to do a book on my dad as a jazz musician, because you always, see the hip, Miles Davis, the hip part of jazz in performance, but there's a whole culture, there's a whole life around being a jazz musician. And so, like my son Mingus, he went to, he went to Germany, he went to Japan, and dealing with that, teaching him, because he was missing school. And when, like in Japan, they were like, black baby, there was a completely, I wanted to capture that aspect of jazz. And for example, I have not in the show, but Nicola, the woman, the grandmother holding her purse. So that's an image that represents to me the people that I knew, like our grandmother going to church and having the money, and the daughters there and the children. And when I was a little girl, when I went with my grandfather, those type of images, that not just images, but tying into the culture, American Black culture. That's what interests me. And all these images, like, for example, this one here, self-portrait, is Josephine. When I was, growing up, Josephine, well, first coming to New York, I didn't know about Josephine Baker in Columbus, Ohio. I used to go to the a library. There were hardly any books on, Black, anybody's, Black culture at all. And when I found out about Josephine Baker, and I was dancing at the time, there was an aspect of her. I knew her as a singer, and this diva, but she was a dancer, and she started out as a chorus girl, and she won attention. She came out because when everybody was smiling, she was making faces, and so she drew attention to herself. So that aspect of, like, say, a Black woman that had aspirations of being more, and that genius of trying to be more in a Jim Crow, like Catherine Dunham, or any of our artists, of what they went through, and how, it's not just the negative part, but the humor of how they became who they were, like Josephine Baker, Zora Neale Hurston. Zora Neale Hurston, like, she's definitely one of my, people that I love, because she was about the culture. And this, this informed my work, not so much specifically what, but just the intent of her work and the appreciation, like Catherine Dunham and Lorraine Hansberry. I mean, that play still is one of the most, I think that's still one of my most favorite plays, not just because they show the struggle in a Black family, but it's very truthful. When I saw Benita, who was dancing, this was a time when we were starting to connect with Africa and saying our culture, is, so we started finding out about that. So when I went to Africa, that was new. That was new. Actually, I went because there was a designer, and he went over there to get fabrics, and he came back to the United States, and he designed this. And then they had chosen a model, and I was one of them. And so we went and photographed it in Africa. And so yeah, it's definitely about the culture, and about the meaning behind these images, but I also, as an artist, and having like a high standard for images, because I studied the masters, of photography, like Versailles, Daisy mentioned was one of my favorites. I love how he deals with light. So I'm an artist and I have that aesthetic, but I wanted to bring that to, in the best way, the most, highest critical way of capturing it, but also being a beautiful art piece, because that's what I am, and I'm a fine art photographer.
Thank you so much, Ming. Daisy, I mean, you said earlier that you are working within, an academic museum and thinking about how the work sort of is pitching forward, if I would use that phrase, and so I wanted us to reflect on that a bit and think through why you think Ming's photographs are relevant and important for these times. I mean, I usually wouldn't want to think in around the notion that there is some kind of recent surge of interest and all that. But I do think that more people are looking at Ming's work now. Definitely more people will look at her work within the next 6 months or so across the country. And I'm curious, in relation to that, why you think these images from the 1970s through the 90s, even more recently, matter for a younger generation.
Well, my first instinct is almost to quote Ming from a few minutes ago, like when she's mentioning seeing Brassai and studying the master. This is why I want to show Ming at the gun, because I think she's a master in her own right, who has created and keep reinventing a canon that she has built for herself. And I want students, again, a younger generation to be able to learn that there's Brassai, there's Cartier-Bresson, and there's Ming Smith. And by diversifying the kind of canonical visual narrative we introduce in the context of academic campus like Kenyon, I think there's just an opportunity to broaden and complexify the way students look at the world. And I think Ming has done that because she's an attuned observer. This image that we see on the screen is so striking, whatever the way it's being presented, and you realize the layering, that there's probably, a movie poster behind it, and then you have this kind of man in a club. It forces us to look so closely and so deeply. And I just think she does that over and over again. If there's any gift in an academic campus, is that gift of observational skills, of engagement that goes above and beyond for a younger generation. I also think everything that Ming's represent within the field of photography is something we need to study more closely. It's something we need to unpack and observe with closer proximity, and because the relevance of her image are as such that even if we're looking at an image from the 70s or 60s, they could have been also of today. There's something about the freshness and the vivacity of the way she composes and captures these moments fleeing that I found to be rare, relevant, and just so potent that I want to spend more time with them. I can tell from the past few days when the exhibition was open, there was such an appetite to understand better who Ming Smith is, to give context to her practice, that it's not just my biased opinion, it's a shared one, to understand better what Ohio has produced. And as it turns out, it has produced Ming Smith to some extent. And so it's exciting to give context to that. But also the humanity in which she captures a subject is also something that I hope is carried into the present and the future. And so learning how that has also been a through line, the kind of empathy and affection and care that she puts in capturing a lonely woman going down the stairs almost completely in the dark, and she's revealed by one ray of light in that really dusty entryway in Paris. How solitude becomes like a common frame for a shared space in the quotidian moment of life, I just think remain quite powerful. I also feel Ming's image allows us to take a pause, to kind of take a moment with them and study more closely. And that kind of temporality is very counterintuitive to the present, where everything can be captured on an iPhone. There's something so immediate about the way we consume and make images that, again, going back to what I keep calling Ming's origin story and from having spent time in the studio, there's many origin stories that we could give context to, but in this case, again, this idea of pausing with images, of looking more deeply, of taking a moment, is just a counter approach that I feel should be that we should return to more and more. And so in working and being in conversation with Ming, all of these things became even more tangible. I'm also, to give more context to the big Ohio moment that Ming is having, we just opened this exhibition at the Gund. My colleagues at the Columbus Museum of Art will also be presenting 2 bodies of work of Ming. And Ming, please jump in, because these exhibitions have not yet been put together, so you have more context for them. But at the Columbus Museum, I believe they are focusing on August Moon, the August Moon series and Transcendence series, which, Ming, is this right? The Transcendence series has been photographed in Ohio.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
For example, the piece before this, before my self-portrait, I wanted to go back, yes. So I took this on my first trip to Paris. And at the time I was friends, she used to live 4 blocks above Christopher Street and in the West Village, and I live 4 blocks down. So sometimes we would go and we would run into each other at these little cheap restaurants where you could get a hamburger for $5. And she didn't have a lot of money either, and she was Lisette Modell, this prolific. And Lisette Modell also was the teacher of Dion Arbus. And so I would always ask her, I didn't really ask her about photography so much, but she would talk about Dion. And at the time I didn't know she was talking about Dion Arbus. She was Dion, and I pronounced her name Diane Arbus. So I didn't know she was talking about her, but she would say she was like, worried about her, et cetera, et cetera. But I asked her a lot about romance because she was always with her husband. And they were always together, and so I would ask. So my first trip to Paris, I took this photograph because it deals with romance, and like in our youth, like for these men, like I don't know who they were, but just how when you're young and you're thinking about love and romance, and there's this poster there. And then these 2 men, and just the thought of that and how we deal. And I was a young girl at that time. And also I photographed Rodin, the sculpture in Paris, and also like Luxembourg. And those photographs are in the show On the Road. But I was saying that to say that I was photographing Paris before I was on the road, as a companion to, the my companion, who is a jazz musician. But the show in the Columbus Fine Arts, it's a really meaningful exhibition for me because I grew up in Columbus, and that was really I only knew my father. We never traveled a lot. I grew up and my father worked pretty much 12 hours a week. And he graduated from Ohio State. My grandmother graduated from Ohio State, my aunts and all of them. And she used to, even though she was she had graduated from college, and she was a teacher. Back then you couldn't teach as a Black woman if you were married. So she used to teach the neighborhood. And so the Ohio, what is it? The Ohio State Fair was like a place where we would go, for my father was always working, he didn't, but my aunts, and my family, that was a highlight. My first job, which I said I was 16, but I was really 15. My first job was there. And my father, he was like, I grew up on the hilltop, and we weren't allowed to do anything, basically. That's why I ran away from home. But all of them graduated from, my family graduated from Ohio State. So I already was, I broke my dad's heart because I didn't graduate and go to college at Ohio State. But the Columbus Fine Arts was the only museum, and I remember that was Columbus Fine Arts, and I really wanted to have a show for my dad. My father had 5 kids and children, and my grandmother, he wanted to be an artist. And my grandma said, no, as a Black male, you will not be able to support your children, being an artist. So he was a pharmacist, and and he worked in drugstore. So I said that, like, one day I'm going to be in this museum. Unfortunately, all my grandparents, my mother, my father, and they're all have passed, and there's no one there. So I feel gratitude for having an exhibition there, but there's some part of me, it feels sad because there's, I wanted to make my, my father and my mother, proud, but that, I guess because the Smiths, they sacrificed so much, they washed clothes and worked in people's homes, and did day work, and they just like work, work, work. And it was like, I wanted to say, this was like, I came from them, and I wanted them to just feel that they, that their life meant something, especially my father. So, but I'm gratitude. They're probably pulling the strings up there, but it's just irony, the irony of life. It really is, interesting. So transcendence, I just want to say transcendence. The Ku Klux Klan were very big in Columbus, Ohio, as I grew up. I mean, even then, they only played Black music during a few hours in the morning and in the evening, and that was it. This was before even Diane Carroll. You didn't see Black images on television. I think Nat King Cole was the only one. So like with transcendence, I experienced a lot of the, violence, Martin Luther King was killed, and Malcolm, it was during that period. So, John F. Kennedy, there was a lot of like violence and going on politically. It was like sad. So with transcendence, I use that word because I wanted to change that energy from what I had experienced to something really powerful and make art of it. Like, I wanted my pain and to mean something, to transform it into something positive and loving and nurturing and healing. So for me, and that's what art for me is, what I aspire to with folks. So like transcendence is like, well, the Ohio State Fair. And so that was my subject. So that's being shown at the Columbus Fine Arts. And then the August Wilson, which is called August Moon, that's about August, his writings, his humor, his understanding of Black culture from, Pittsburgh. He was in the Hill District. I grew up on the hilltop. So when I saw the play Two Trains Running, I was like these are the same characters that I love. Like, there would be a man with a bottle of liquor, and street folks or blues folks in his pocket, And this could be one of this genius. There was this genius layman that laid cement or made walls, you know, like little walls that were painted houses. They did this, and it was so beautiful, the artistic of how they did things. But this guy looked like, you know, like a bum basically, or an alcoholic just down the street. And he talked about these folks, and I was like, those are the same folks that I understand. The man who might, you know, there was a possum in my garage, and he was laying the foundation for cement in the yard. And this, you know, there's a whole possum story about how he became friends, you know, with my brothers and everything like this. So his stories, they parallel with my stories. And so I said, oh, well, I want to go photograph Pittsburgh. So that came out of, you know, his words and my images, which, you know, so, and that's being shown. They chose that series to be shown on, you know, 2 different shows at the Ohio, in Ohio.
At the Columbus Museum of Art.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Columbus.
And I want to pause on this image for a minute, but I want to make sure you can also share a little bit, Ming, what's being shown at the Wexner, because the Wexner, so we have the Gund at Kenyon College, we have the Columbus Museum of Art, and then you're also presenting at the Wexner Art Center at OSU. And I believe it's a collaboration with Mingus, your son. Can you share more, depending on where you're at in that creative process? Because the arc of these 3 projects is as such that at the Gun, you have kind of the earlier work while traveling on the road, looking again, as I mentioned, of these through lines of capturing Black lives and thinking about identity formation outside of the home. Then at the Columbus Museum of Art, you have these 2 really anchoring body of work, August Mood and Transcendence, that are looking at the question of home or the role that literature and writing has played in your life. And at the Wexner, there's a new work. And so I just think it's interesting how these 3 projects provide this kind of arc in your practice. But yeah, I'm curious if you can share more about the Wexner presentation.
Oh, the Wexner is interesting because that's part of Ohio State, and you know,
exactly.
So it's very meaningful. So we're planning to do, but we're not sure of the time, a hologram. But the Wexner, there's photographs of Africa and that first trip, and also photographs of me in Africa and that's the reason why I went over there. So, and there was an article that came out, so that's one of them, and then African photographs. So that's the main thrust of the show at the Wexner.
Thank you, Ming. I know many ideas are still in development, so I just wanted us to have the full arc or an introduction to it. Yes.
Yeah, I think we might have a few, like 10 or so minutes before we open up for Q&A. One of the things that I've sort of been thinking about in relation to the fact that you've practiced work, you've made pictures for 5 decades, is just how so much has changed in the ways photographs are made, displayed, distributed, you know, since, for instance, when you joined the Kaimonge workshop. And I'm curious to know how you think about the medium, right, at this point in its evolution. I know you're still making photographs, you're still taking commissions, for instance, and where you think the medium is headed.
Well, for instance, the exhibition at the Nicola Bassel's show, there's a photograph of the kids on the raft. And then there's also, like, you could see show that photo on the raft. I see someone. It's on the invitation, I think. What I liked about photography is that, so there were so many people that said, oh, they bring back memories. the one that's on the raft, the little boys, they're floating. They're like little piggy banners. But anyway, they bring back stories. And when I, countless of stories of, people see them and say, oh, I remember when I was a kid, I did this, or we used paper boxes and, there would be a snowstorm and then we'd slide down the mountain. And, I love that aspect. But now, first of all, there's images everywhere. It's like we're flooded with images, images, images. So there's so many images, I feel like, I don't know if anyone even knows this, they used to have party line, like you'd have a telephone and 3 people and you could only talk to someone with the other person wasn't, your neighbor wasn't on. I mean, or even a telephone booth. It's like, pretty like archaic basically. But so now I think like AI is like maybe like would these images even exist? This part of life would, this is like old stuff, it's like everything is so different now that at least we have this to show, the history of where we were and nostalgia, is that important or not? I think that was one of the first questions, or when I first heard about photography as an art form, they were saying, is it an art form or isn't it an art form? Or if it was, and I remember Japanese was saying that it was all nostalgia, so now with AI, I think people can create images, is this a real image? Is this a real person? So it's like going to the moon now as far as imagery. Even a hologram is like, is that really, a person there, or is it, it's like, so, yeah, because it's all imagery. It's all imagery. So this is just a period of time. Now I think people are dealing mainly with identity and, their family, their maybe family, but I think and their story, which is good, but I think there's so much more that's coming or has already come, You might see me one day walking, it's not even me. You say, hi, Ming. That's not really me. So, we'll see.
Yeah, and Daisy, I wanted to also, I wanted you to have a word on that question, especially again, you're presenting these images in Ohio. Is this part of what you are thinking about in relation to the students who are seeing it? Are you thinking about not just, Ming's work as a master of photography, but also Ming's work as essentially an articulation of what the medium now is and what the medium potentially would be?
I talked a lot about the students. There's also the community that surrounds us that comes to the museum. I would say I'm more thinking about it in regards to a continuum. Um, Kenyon has this really interesting relationship with photography in which the tintype, the kind of ancestor of photography, the tintype was patented at Kenyon by a faculty member. And so for me, I see this, that's what I mean by continuum. Like we're all taking images with our phone, but going back to what a tintype is, how it's being made is something that we pride ourselves in sharing. Also looking at the work of someone like Ming and our images is an opportunity to expand on what photography is and making sure there's a clear understanding of how the history of image making as it can be understood today through a very effective and rapid technology also takes part of a long process that requires knowledge and trials and error and an ability to work tools and a system in a very different way. So making sure we, again, interrupt the rapid pace and allow us to circle back and take a moment to look at how things were actually made, how they can remain a part of our active an active creative practice, but also the impact of those images remain. It remains something of tremendous potential and paramount need in our understanding of the present. So yeah, there's a little bit of an historical point of view. There's also an opportunity to show the world as big as it is. But again, to connect us with Ohio, with someone who is kind of made through an Ohio connection, is also something that we center as a way to look at all the ways in which her work is so much more global. And so it's the practice, it's the way of making, but it's also how the work, the research, and 5 decades of taking images. What does it say? What does it offer? And how it expands our understanding of the world beyond our walls.
Mm. Just one final question that I have for Ming, and it's quite broad, so I imagine that you would, take your time with it. But again, as I said at the beginning, I'm quite really fascinated and also inspired, really is the word, by the fact that you've been making pictures for 5 decades. And the question I wanted to ask, and I hope it's of use to others besides me, is what has made this endeavor of making pictures over these decades worth it? You've essentially just captured images that point to the richness of Black life, the richness of place, and hint at so many things. And now that you can reflect on your work retrospectively, I'm curious about how you think of what you've done in the broadest, or even particular, in the broadest sense possible, or even in a particular sense as well.
That photograph before that, the survivor, like I love that image because that's Black lives, but I wanted to, with that photograph, about the humanity, and there were, this woman remind me of Lisette, but also of people who survived World War II. And you could kind of see them walking around Europe, by themselves. You didn't really know, but you did know, and being very alone and feeling the sadness and just humanity. Yeah, so I just wanted to address that with that photograph because this is one of my favorite photographs, But I mean, there was just so many, like you would see, I was always aware of elders, older people in different, countries, and you could just kind of feel the pain. And especially, even if there were a couple, there was just something very, lonely, and that they had been through a lot. So I call that survivor. So now the question you asked me was, what just remind me, again, you were saying, asking, could you repeat?
Yeah. So yeah, I was just saying that essentially what has made the endeavor of making pictures over 5 decades worth it for you?
So my intent was to, capture the humanity of things, life, something to me that was real, not necessarily glamorized, or just the real culture wherever I was, wherever, and create beautiful images. I hope that, the younger artists somehow, I influence them, or they're inspired to do their own images, and whether it's entertaining to them, or if it helps them on the road find the keys of where they want to go, basically. And the masters, you know, I mean, like we talked about by side, but you know, Robert Frank and all the Canon, Gordon Parks, Roy DeGraw, all those people influenced me. So I want to influence the younger, you know, generation, whoever artist, period, you know, not just younger. Because I know a lot of seniors are taking photos now. So yeah, that's that's I guess that's what it is.
Mm. Yeah, so I think we have a bunch of questions, and I'll just hand over to Eleanor, Chloe, to moderate that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emmanuel. And thank you so, so much, Ming and Daisy, for everything that was shared during this brilliant conversation. It's been such a wonderful dialogue. Thank you so much. We do have a few questions here, and I will start by asking a question on behalf of Lena in the audience. Lena wrote, how do your photographs engage with the themes of Black aesthetics and improvisation from an epistemological standpoint as articulated by Fred Moten in his analysis of jazz as a Black radical tradition?
I think she could explain that a little more, but I just, as far as jazz, I was very influenced by jazz, not by just the music, but in the technique of improvising. Jazz, you know, you would hear the head or you would hear the melody that they would play in the beginning. And afterwards, the band, or it could be a single trombone player or the pianist, they took their turn to improvise. And they would let it go wherever it would take them. And, you know, sometimes like I would hear sometimes say, oh gosh, I must have been, you know, I heard Coltrane come through me, or, you know, they, you know, say that like I was channeling Coltrane or something. They felt that way. I felt that way like when I was taking my photography, but basically it started out with something like in a box, and then going outside of the box. Like you heard the tune or you heard the melody, they call it in jazz, okay, let's hit the head. And then you improvise. And that's what I've done in my practice mainly. And even with circular breathing, something as basic as breathing, the photograph was it was enlarged at the recent MoMA Studio Museum show of Hart Leroy Bibbs, and it's called Circular Breathing. And I was photographing in Paris of jazz, and I was holding my camera because like we didn't have the technology, so I had to hold it really still. I used fast film, but it was low lit, and I was like, and then Hart Leroy Bibbs, he came up and said, you know what you're doing, you're circular breathing. And I was like, circular breathing, and I like that, right? Because you're holding it. And so there's a thing that musicians do where they have, when they practice, because I remember David was, you know, practicing circular breathing. You have this candle and you have to, you know, you have to learn how to breathe and keep it going without taking another breath. So it's called circular breathing. And he told me that's what I was doing. And so that's why I say I'm very influenced, you know, by, you know, jazz.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ming. The next question is going to be from Sarah, and I'll also ask on Sarah's behalf. Sarah is wondering, where do you see your photography practice going in regards to your contemporary works?
Where do I see it going? meaning
in the future.
all over the world, in the outer space, that's where I see it going. Also, I really want to, like, I loved going to see, in the early days of New York, black and white films. And, I was very influenced by that. I love those old black and white films. They had like real purpose and humanity. And so I do see, you know, them, living in some kind of film or being jump off a place of jumping off to something into film as well.
Wonderful. The next question is from Leah. Leah is wondering if there's a photo maybe in the Nicola Vassell show or in the Gund that is one of your favorites, and if you could tell us more about it, and I can pull it up as well if one comes to mind.
All of them are my favorites.
Oh.
These are years and years of editing. For me, that's almost like asking, which child do you like better? The daughter or the son? I can't really say, but let's see. Well, say you could pull up some of the jazz. Maybe that's one of the newer kind of ways, like photographing, which is, you don't see that type of image. It's new, of like using, and then it is jazz, that photograph. The jazz musicians, there's two in Nicola's show. In fact, I like that wall because it's called The Cats. It's all the cats. And, we have two photographs of Tom and Jerry, and they're on the piano, and they're real cats, right? And they call jazz musicians cats. And then I have my photographs that kind of, I would do straight photography, and then it jumped off to movement and improvising and different things. So you could bring that, you could show those photographs. And I call that the cats, and they're all on one wall. But can someone show that photograph? It's more abstract.
Ming, I'm wondering if maybe there's also, we didn't talk about this, but one of the images where you're adding paint, because that energy, this idea of movement and improvisation also comes across in those images.
Okay, yeah. Let me see. I just wanted to make the point of that. It's on one wall. I don't see it. Didn't see it on there. But anyways, the jazz cats. Yeah, that's the back room. Those are all vintage prints. You said adding paint. Well, basically I added paint to photographs because, well, how should I say? They have something called pavé art, where you take things and you make something art out of them, like, plastic bottles. I remember seeing this beautiful piece that was on the beach in Brazil. These photographs, like, for example, a print wouldn't be perfect the way I wanted it. So I wanted to make it better. So instead of throwing those prints away or storing away, I added paint to make it better rather than throwing it away, because it was a good print, but maybe something was a little off. Maybe, for example, this Boucherie, the face might have been too dark, or you couldn't see something, so I added paint to it. But I guess I don't have the jazz, because the jazz wall of Nicola, I guess it's not on there, right? I was just trying to really answer that question.
I can keep looking for it. And
okay, we can go on for another question, then you'll find it. It's like, I don't know what the name of it is, but one is Tom and Jerry. One is in the beginning, some is and they're playing the piano.
Yeah, I know
So
exactly.
people might not understand that, but if they see the image, I think it will make sense to them.
Yeah, I think I'll be able to pull it up.
Okay.
But in the meantime, let's take another question. The next question will be, oh, it's actually going to be the one that I wanted to ask, which might be a nice follow-up. And I'm wondering, most of the images that we've been looking at today, many of them are in black and white, but there are a few of them that are in color. And I'm wondering if you could share with us, Ming, a little bit more about how you think about color, or how you kind of make those choices in your work.
Okay, that's an easy question because when with the rudiments of photography, it was like advertising was more in color, and fine art photography because it was the art of black and white, and creating something out of black and white and all those tones. So I photographed, it was like if you shot color, you were like, being a whore or something. It was just like a thing not to do in the beginning. And it also was expensive, to develop color at the time. And, something I was, planning, I was going to be, I was chosen to be in early days in the Museum of Modern Art's calendar, and it was on jazz, and they had chosen one of the photographs for the collection. And then when I went, and it wasn't, they called me, interviewed, me, and et cetera, et cetera. And when I went to get the calendar, it wasn't, they didn't have it in the calendar. And I was like, oh, I was so upset because it was like, okay, I was in the Museum of Modern Art, and this is maybe 4 years later, but nothing really had happened in my career. It was like winning the Academy Award and no one knowing it. So anyway, I was like so happy we're being the jazz calendar, the Museum of Modern Art. And then I was so disappointed. I mean, it was the only thing in my life that was like supportive of my practice. And so the people in the bookstore, they said, well, the curator, you can go see her and ask her why they didn't have it. And so, she told me because one of the pieces were in color. I had painted the jazz musician. And I was like, well, it's just like, she said it was too expensive. They could only use 2 in color, right? And so I'm walking out and out the door, and she says, well, don't be too, she says, I don't know if this will make you feel any better, but like you lost out to Matisse. And I said, to Matisse? I was like, oh, that makes me feel better. And I mean, it was like really, I mean, just show you how that just like any type of confirmation or validation from someone or of my image, and that was like, because I love Matisse. I mean, he was like one of my favorite, and he has those jazz images that I love. I love his work. So but also practically, I used to carry a camera with black and white and color because some things were so beautiful. 2 cameras plus a video camera, and sometimes a backpack with my kid on the back with all this stuff. I can't even do that now, not even 1 camera now. So, but and walk around like that. But 1 black and white for film on this camera, and this was a color. Because some of the images I saw were so beautiful. And that's actually what I'm doing now, is like printing up some of those images and going through them, really. Some beautiful, beautiful work, some beautiful images, and I'm happy. And after seeing Gordon Parks, he has a few images of I think in the 50s, and there's a girl and a family. It's probably one of the most famous color photographs of. And I'm like, I should have done more, but I listened to them so much, and I didn't want to be a whore, that was for sure, in my work, especially. But yeah, that's.
Thank you so much, Ming. And I do have that great image that we were discussing before, so I'm going to pull that up now.
It's that entire wall.
Yeah.
So that's the jazz. That's Tom. And then the next one, see, this is the jazz where I say improvising, where my practice went to that. Then there's the next one, another one, like sort of like that. So yeah, that's jazz. And I call that jazz. I mean, it is jazz, but it's visual jazz. And then there was a Jerry. Anyway, so maybe the other one. I don't know. You might not have that one, but it's Tom and Jerry. They're both on the piano. The cat and the mouse, right?
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much for that super generous answer. And I'm going to turn to Chloe now for the next question.
Thank you so much, Ming, Emmanuel, and Daisy for this dialogue. Ming, especially in consideration of all of these shows opening in Ohio and this sort of constellation of return to Ohio and considering that space, I wanted to ask you about your relationship to self-portraiture in your work and how it operates for you personally, and if your relationship to your self-portraits has changed with time as you've exhibited them.
Well, I've changed, that's for sure, visually. But with my self-portraits, like they call them now, selfies, basically when I'm photographing, I'm outside of myself. I'm not thinking about myself at all. And luckily, sometimes when I'm photographing, like I would see myself in the mirror and I was like, oh, that's a good image. But I wasn't really looking at how I looked, but it was like visually a good image. It was like I was just photographing. And that's how 90% of my self-portraits came about. I was just photographing other things, and then I saw myself and I said, oh, whether it was a reflection, in glass or a mirror or whatever, I photographed it. And that's how self-portraits came about. I knew nothing about selfies at all, but like some people say, oh, you did the original selfie. But other photographers, did that. And now pretty much all photographers do selfies with their cameras now. So that's how that came about.
Amazing. Thank you, Chloe, for that question. And our final question of the Q&A today will be from Uletha, and I will allow you to unmute.
Hello. Thank you so much for being here for your talk. I wanted to know, what do you notice, or have you noticed any differences with how people respond to your work in different countries? So, for example, I, as a Black American woman, I might be looking for something and respond to it with my experience or my ancestry or what have you, et cetera. But in another country or someone who's not as familiar, do people impose one story on your work? And do you find yourself having to play kind of teacher photographer in a way, filling that kind of role? I would like to know, just out of curiosity, how do you respond in those instances?
Well, I think around 2 years ago, I was in London and I met a young woman photographer, and she had to photograph me, and she wanted to photograph me in her studio. And so I went there. I remember, we passed. I remember the house in Worth with Ed Clark. Accidentally, I wanted to see, his work, the painter Ed Clark, and I was like, wow, Ed Clark. And we were going. It was just very magical. And then when I was, posing for this, and I'm like, oh no, the lighting is this and stuff. I saw my book that was like the app book that's being republished by Aperture. And I said, oh, yeah, I see you, Mom. She says, yes, I saved my money up and I only have 2 books. And one of them was my book. And she said, you don't know how much you know, inspired me. And like, it's like great to meet you. And I saw the images. And that meant so much to me because like she was on it. She was going to be a photographer and she was like, you know, and I get that response. So that's very, you know, fulfilling and gratitude because this was my intent. The way Sweet Fly Paper, you know, with Roy DeCarava and Ralph Ellison, or Raisin in the Sun, how that just moved me to be an artist. This is what I hope, and that's what my aspirations be in the world.
Thank you so much for that question. And thank you again, Ming and Emmanuel and Daisy, for this beautiful conversation. Before we conclude today, I'll turn it back to you, Ming, for a reading.
Oh, okay. So they didn't tell me at the, you know, I didn't know I was going to have to do a reading, but like I'm happy to do this because I'm doing with the show in Columbus, Ohio. Jacqueline Woodson is writing words from my poem. I mean, from my photograph, she's written poems because she's from Columbus, Ohio. So it's 2 Black women that's going to be in Columbus Fine Arts. So I'm really happy. So I'm going to read one of the. I have a piece called, there's 2 or 3 pieces especially, but I'm going to read this one because one of my pieces were called Cotton Candy, and this is what she wrote. And so I'm going to read that one, Cotton Candy. Cotton candy, how sweet the world is, how soft, how kind. Think about it. The first time you were handed a pink sugar dream on a white paper cone, sticky and sweet and disappearing into the heat of your joyous mouth, you were a child then, still believing in the magic and lights and rides and games at the fair. You were a child then with grown-ups smiling all around you saying, take this dollar, go buy yourself what you want. The world was rich then, unending. Even when the darkness fell, there was still light all around you. Think about it. Remember how sweet the world was? Hold on to this memory and look, you've brought it all back again. I love that poem.
That was so beautiful, Ming. Thank you so much.
I just want to say one thing else. Paul Laurence Dunbar, my grandfather took me when I was like 7, like maybe 9. I always make things long. I was a child. And we went to see Paul Laurence Dunbar's house in Dayton, Ohio. And my grandfather was like, oh, you can see the shoes and his bed, and it was in a brick house, and, you know, it was an outing. And then as a child, I saw it and I was like, I didn't say anything to my granddad because he was also brought me to New York the first time. But I was like, that was all musty and old. I did not get that at all. But now I did because they loved poetry and they would recite poetry. They would recite Paul Laurence Dunbar and other American poets, but he was a favorite. So I just wanted to say that since we're talking about poetry.
Thank you so much, Ming. That was really wonderful. Thank you.
It was a great poem. I mean, like,
so good.
I mean, that's
She's the best.
great piece. Yeah.
Yeah, she's so wonderful. We dropped a link in the chat for more on Jacqueline Woodson. Thank you so much again, Emmanuel and Ming and Daisy. This has been so special. And
Thank you.
go see the show at Nicola Vassal. And if you're in Ohio, there's many opportunities to see Ming's work in person. I'd also like to express my gratitude to Molly and the team at Nicola Vassal, and also to Ming's studio and to the team at The Gund for supporting us as we prepared for today's program. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and supporting our archive, which you can explore on our YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 23 years. A donation will directly support our writers, production staff, and operations, and you can support us through the link in the chat. And join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for Revisiting Studies into Darkness Part 3, Aberrating the Image Archives as Surveillance, featuring Maya Jeffries and Ayana Dozier. Thank you all so much again, and thank you for tuning in. Thank you for the great questions. And you can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ming.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Daisy.
Thank you all.
That
Thank
was
you.
amazing. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Ming. Thank you, Daisy. Thank you,
It was
Emmanuel.
wonderful.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.
Everyone.
Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.